Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Clark. I'm the Vice President and Dean of Bethel Seminary out of St. Paul, and it's just really great to be with you all this afternoon. I'm excited about this session. We've been preparing for a lot of weeks now, number of weeks, and I'm excited to have this chance to talk about a really critical topic at this time in the history of our nation and the history of our movement. The topic that I want to talk about today is connecting culture. And this is not so much about dealing with specific issues within culture, but really about understanding a positive stance toward culture. So there are lots of issues in our culture that we would like to talk about. One person came up and said, "Are you going to talk about sexuality?" And not really. A couple of allusions here and there. At Bethel, we just had a tremendous conference on transgenderism, which is another hot issue in the press. We're really not going to talk about that. Issues of race are important. Immigration, incarceration, education, law. There's all sorts of specific issues that we could talk about. And I believe we need to talk about them more and more because we live in a time, as you are all sensing and you're aware, when the church is not flowing with the culture and more we're sort of flowing against the culture. We're swimming upstream in ways that we have not in multiple generations, about 150 years really. We'll talk a little bit about that history. And so because we're not sort of floating with and sharing all the cultural values that we see around us, it requires that we be more specific and articulate and detailed and precise in how we understand these issues. Because when we're speaking from a minority position, your ideas and your thoughts and your words are subject to critique and capture and even YouTubing. Is that a verb? And so, it's a more complicated world to live in. And as I think about my role as the seminary dean, one of the things that really challenges me is that when Scott talks about the importance of a farm system, that we need a generation of men and women coming up to lead in all sorts of places, churches, nonprofits, even the marketplace. And we need these folks to understand the cultural issues around because what we believe God's Word teaches does not line up with what we inherit without thinking about it from our culture. So in a time when those two things line up closely, you don't have to think about it too much. You could just think what everybody else thinks and you're good to go. But living in a time when things are not quite as lined up, the idea of thinking more precisely becomes all the more necessary. And so we at Bethel Seminary are pretty intense about seeking to offer thought leadership to the movement and to the church around these contemporary issues because we think differently and therefore we have to think precisely, not overstate our case but not understate our case. Speak it with confidence and precision and humility. And it is required of us to do that even more in this day when the broader culture is not sort of trending with us. And a great example of that, it's already been mentioned, is what's going on in California today and tomorrow. Any of you who are from California, if you want to step out and call your congressperson, feel free to do that. But this is the bill, SB 1146. That the California legislature is actually looking at right now, and it's called Post-Secondary Education Non-Discrimination. But the thing is, it discriminates against faith-based universities. And so, of course, Jay and the cabinet and all of us who are at Bethel pay attention to this kind of stuff because, what starts in California ends up in Minnesota sooner or later. That's true with El Nino, and it's true with SB 1146, probably. This is a bill that is basically saying we're going to have outlaw discrimination, and in the name of outlawing discrimination, they're imposing discrimination, making it difficult for faith-based schools to exercise religious liberty and to operate within their religious convictions. And so I think you understand this is the world that we live in. So in that context, what I'd like to do is to talk, first of all, about the meaning of culture. I've passed out a handout. We'll walk through this quickly. I want you to know as well that if you have some comments or questions along the way, we're going to have some dialogue, even though we're a bit of a larger group, and I hope that you'll feel free to share a thought or two along the way. What exactly is culture? Well, the word culture actually comes from a Latin root, and it means to take something and to change it, to take a raw material and to make something different out of that raw material. Think, for example, of agriculture. Agriculture takes the soil and the plants, and it makes something a little different out of that soil and out of that plant than what was there at the beginning. So people who are involved in agriculture are not just doing hunting and gathering, eating stuff that just kind of comes up on its own, but they're deliberately working with the land to make it something other than what it was. So Andy Crouch, who's written a terrific book on culture making, and I'll be indebted to some of his thoughts along the way today. Andy Crouch talks about the continuum between wilderness on the one hand and the theme park on the other hand. So in the wilderness, everything is natural and nothing is cultivated. In the theme park, everything is cultivated and there's not a natural thing there. You can't even find a tree. It's made out of cement and it's painted, right? So you've got this contrast between everything is natural and everything is human-made or artificial. But a better analogy for culture is like a garden, which starts with the raw materials of nature, but it's been cultivated. In fact, I think it's very interesting that Adam and Eve were placed in as we all know, a garden, a place that was sort of this combination of the natural world, but also shaped by human purposes and ultimately divine purposes. And so culture is like a garden, a natural world that's been cultivated. And we live in a garden in a way, created by God, but cultivated by us. It's this wonderful combination. Now the word continues to grow and change in its meaning, and more recently it has come to mean something very important in the whole realm of the social sciences. So when we think about a contemporary meaning of the word culture, that taps us into topics like cultural anthropology and sociology. That's kind of the home territory for the word culture. Now, if we think about human beings, there's one sense in which every single one of us in this room is alike. There are certain things that as human beings, as members of the species human being, we share these things. So theologically, we think of the fact that every single person is made in the image of God. Okay. So every human person has been made by God, has been made for a purpose by God, and we share that. That's something that is a place of unity among us. There's also some aspects of who we are that are unique to each of us as individuals. And we all have a different Myers-Briggs profile or, a different strength finder set. We have different personalities. Some of us are extroverts like Laurel Bunker. She's got enough extroversion for a whole crowd, actually. You probably feel that. And then others, are so introverted they can hardly talk in a public setting and so forth. So each of us has this individual set of characteristics that is like the snowflake, or the thumbprint. We're absolutely unique. Now, between those two extremes, that which we share theologically and that which makes each one of us absolutely unique psychologically, that's your psychological profile, there's this middle zone where I, as an individual, share some things with a group. I'm part of a team. I'm part of a tribe. And my culture is tied up with the life of my tribe. So I am what I am because of my group membership, my group identification. It's like my group DNA. Now, literally, of course, DNA is unique to each one of us. We all inherited our DNA from mom and dad. So technically speaking, DNA is personal to me. But group DNA, like when I think of the DNA of an organization or the DNA of a church or something like that, it's that inherited something that makes this group different from that group. See? And every one of us, we're part of different groups. So one way to think about culture would be to define it as the patterned ways that groups of people do things together. Culture is the patterned ways that groups of people do things together. Now, I grew up in Tokyo, Japan. My mom and dad were missionaries, not Baptist General Conference missionaries, but worked with a high school group. So I'm one of these oddball people that's kind of both and. I'm a third culture person, we say today. I'm not 100%. When I'm in Japan, I'm sort of a little bit of an oddball because I'm an American. But when I'm here, I'm a little bit of an oddball because I'm Japanese. So I don't really fit either way, right? That's what we used to call missionary kids are like that. But Lois here, Lois Bjork, or I'm sorry, Lois Larson. Yeah, they've been married for 62 years now. No. How many years has it been?
46.
46 wonderful years. So back when Lois was Lois Bjork, when we were sort of growing up together at the missionary kids school in Japan, so we have this common thing that we share. We know some of the same people, we remember some of the same events, we're sort of part of the same group. And when I go back for a high school reunion to meet people I haven't seen in 10 years, but I grew up with them and we're all this third culture thing, I feel like I'm meeting people that are my closest, dearest friends. I haven't talked to them in 20 years, but they're very close. Why? Because we're in the same group. We're part of the same tribe. And everybody has a tribe. So culture is something that groups or tribes or families produce from the raw materials that God has created. They use work to till that raw material. It gets modified over time, and this is important. So new inventions can gradually adjust a culture. If you don't think culture has changed, I can prove you wrong. Right? Technology is a huge driver of cultural change. Just as a quick example, when I'm teaching a class, and you are all not doing this, and I so love you for this, but back at the seminary, everybody's got their laptop popped open, and as soon as I say, you know, Karl Barth wrote this book in 1915, about 8 seconds later, somebody will say, no, it was 1912. Okay. So, you know, there's like this constant fact-checking going on, you know? It really makes it hard to be a teacher, you know? You're afraid to say stuff, actually. It's just not good. But here's one of the other examples of how this has affected culture. May 1st is the date when everybody has their fall schooling signed, sealed, and delivered. So everybody, all high school seniors know where they're going for school by May 1st. That was before smartphones taught us to do everything last minute. We're still getting inquiries like, is there room for me this fall? I'd like to apply to be a student this fall at Bethel. It's like, May 1st is past. But guess what? Culture has changed. We think differently. And by the way, that thinking goes deep, because did you know that your brain actually wires up? The synapses of your brain and the neurons of your brain connect up based on your experiences of the world. So as they say, what fires together, wires together. This is what's so bad about addictions. You know, you do a couple things, but you're not just doing a thing, you're rewiring your brain. And to unrewire that is a complicated deal. It's possible, but it's very, very hard. So culture changes dramatically. Inventions and technology and art and media, these are things that have tremendous impact on culture. Economics has a tremendous impact on culture. Think about the difference of what happened when somebody invented the printing press. We have a 450-year-old Torah at Bethel. It's a wonderful gift. Students can look at something that was written basically by calligraphy. A copy of the Torah took a year to produce. As we know today with printing presses, you produce a copy of the Bible in a snap, right? That made a fundamental difference in how Europe processed information, not visually through stained glass windows, but textually through written language. And of course, that helped to rewire people's brains, right? How you process information, what fires together, wires together. Now we're moving back to a visual culture. And so again, things are being pushed by technology. So culture is produced out of raw material by human work. It's modified by the material objects within it, like objects of art or technological pieces. It's stored in artifacts or objects of art, or it can be stored in social practices, like how we speak to each other. And of course, it's preserved over time by stories. Stories will take ideas and give them sort of a permanent status in our minds. Music is a good example of culture, and music is attached to groups. So groups have their own music. Have you noticed that? Obviously. Think worship wars here. Music starts with the raw material of sound. But then some human being puts those sounds together in particular arrangements with a particular feel and a particular flavor. And after a while they get so those flavors and those sounds can deeply affect the emotions. And then everything the group believes can be embedded into that music. So the hopes and the beliefs and the sorrows and the values of a group can actually sort of be in the music itself. And when people hear that music in certain contexts, it evokes incredible emotion, right? Because that's all wired into your brain as well. And so music can ultimately become the glue that holds a culture together. So when we say, we're not going to sing your music anymore, we're going to sing our music, what are you saying? You know, I have some sympathy for people for whom, changes in worship is hard because it really is striking very, very deep. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I think we should for very important missional reasons. But I'm just saying I have a lot of sympathy for people who have to walk through that journey. I thought I'd give you an example of a piece of music. And I want you to tell me what this music says about the people who composed it and the people who wrote these words. So here's the verse. This is the chorus on the screen, but the words go like this. When Britain first, at heaven's command, arose out of the azure main. Okay, so how did Britain come to be? God made it, yeah. Now that already is an incredible claim, isn't it? By the way, lots of nations think that. So, go back to my homeland of Japan. Our story is that there's a sun goddess. Her name is Amaterasu Omikami. That'll be on the final. And, she created Japan. The original sun god thrust a spear into the Pacific Ocean, pulled the spear out, and little drops of water hit the surface of the ocean, and everywhere there was a drop, an island was formed. And that's how Japan came to be. Does this sound familiar to anybody? We've got a Japanese team right over here, so if I need correction, Google it and then send me a text. And I will ignore it. But anyway, that's the creation myth, right? So Britain, at heaven's command, arose out of the azure main. This was the charter of the land. Okay, so somebody wrote a charter to tell the Britons how they're supposed to think about the world, and guardian angels sang this strain. So there's a charter, and it's angels, representatives of heaven, who are letting everybody know that this is the way it's going to be with Britain. And when you finish singing that part, then you sing this. Rule Britannia. Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. What does that tell you about this people? Powerful. It's powerful, isn't it? Powerful. Yeah. And it's a self-image of who they are, right? And it declares to themselves who they are, and it also declares to the Germans who they are, and everybody else out there, right? So music becomes a powerful way of capturing, storing, passing on, and then influencing a whole new generation with a set of values and ideas and perspectives that they don't even know they're picking up. They're just singing a song, right? This is why we teach our children to sing songs, by the way. So let's talk about this a little bit more deeply. Let's talk about the aspects of culture. So culture and personal identity. One of the strongest places where culture and personal identity works itself out is in social class. Culture and personal identity. When you are part of a culture, your culture connects you with the people in your own group. That's unity. It also distinguishes you from the people of the other group. And that's identity. So identity is what basically defines who I am. There are lots of things about me that you can quickly see. For example, I'm 6'2". I'm male. I am Caucasian. Maybe by looking at my dress you can tell something about what I do, especially if I, instead of wearing the Converge hat, I wear the Bethel hat. I would be sharing with you, right, who I am. And so there are lots of things that describe me, but there are very few things that actually define me. So what if, instead of being 6'2", what if I were 6'4"? Would I still be the same person? Yeah, I think so, basically. I'd be just as annoying as always, you know. All the characteristics would still be there, probably. So when you talk about things that define you, those are things that, you know, you could change, but it doesn't really change your identity. But when you start talking about something, I think I used the wrong word. Let me back up and say that again so I get it right. When I use a word that describes me, that's what I meant to say, then that, you know, I can change that and I'm still the same person. But a word that defines me, now that is, if you change that, that's so deep that I really become a fundamentally different person. So you all heard Pastor Laurel Bunkler this morning. She's a good buddy. Let's suppose that Pastor Laurel and I are standing here together. Now, you may have noticed she's a woman. I'm a man. We're different. Okay? She wears high-heeled spikes. The higher, the better. If it's not at least 7 inches tall, it doesn't pass muster. So I don't wear high heels. Now, if she wore flats, she'd still be who she is, right? I'm Caucasian. She's black. We both work for the same school, so there's a commonality. But there are a lot of things about us that are different. But here's the thing. In terms of identity, we actually share the same identity. What do you think that is? When she puts her spikes on, we're both 6'2". No. That's not it. We're both Christ followers. See? At that point, the point of identity, the thing that defines who I am, okay, at that point, we're together. We're in the same tribe. Now, if I were to allow color of skin to trump Christ followership, okay, that's something we'd need to think about. I think in our fellowship here, we don't let that be the trump card, right? Christ following is the most important thing. Now think about the gay community. What is it that defines a gay person? They have allowed or chosen their sexuality to be the thing that actually defines who they are. And it actually confers membership in a tribal group, which has a whole set of shared common practices, a shared language, shared values, a shared lifestyle. And when you say, I'm gay, what you're saying is, I'm on that team, right? I'm heterosexual, not homosexual. But that's not the thing that I have determined is my identifier. It's Christ followership that is the thing that is my identity. So identity is really, really important because it tells me who I am. And if I challenge your identity or you challenge my identity, you're challenging something that's very, very deep. Yes? Now think about conversion from Islam. How hard is that? Well, that's not like putting on a new shirt, right? Or deciding I'm going to like country music instead of classical music. Although that could be really hard too. Just kidding. Now, when you think about this whole culture and personal identity thing, social class is a huge, huge piece of that. Here's a picture from England about 100 years ago. Think Downton Abbey for all of you who are in that zone. What you see here, obviously, is group identity, and also there is a group divide. And how is that being shown? Dress is a key part of it. Posture even communicates, doesn't it? And these guys back here are smirking. Yeah, and these guys are, what? Ignoring them purposefully. There's a whole story here, isn't there? Of the grind between two groups of people with a whole different way of thinking about the world and a whole different lifestyle. Just recently, ESPN has come out with a documentary on O.J. Simpson. And have you seen this? O.J. Made in America. There's a line in there that just blows me away when O.J. says, "I'm not black, I'm O.J." What does that mean? Isn't that an incredible statement? Because our ethnicity is something that we tend to identify with closely unless we decide to do something else. And so he's deliberately saying, I'm going to choose a different group to identify with. Culture can work at many scales. So one scale would be as small as a married couple. Married couple have their own little culture in a way, like inside jokes. Sandy and I have inside jokes. We're not going to tell them to you because you won't think they're funny. We think they're hysterical, but you won't get it, right? You know what I mean. Or a family. Shared experiences of a family develop this, It can also happen at a mid kind of range like in an organization. So Mission Hills has a culture. Mission Hills as a church, and your church has a culture. It might be healthy, it might not be healthy. It might be something that you need to deliberately adjust to make it healthy. And then, of course, there's also the possibility of macro culture at the macro level. A whole nation can have a culture. So I am who I am, in part because of my tribe. I may introduce myself to you, and probably one of the things I will do in that moment is to share with you the tribe I'm in. But even when I'm not sharing my tribe or introducing myself and saying, yeah, I'm a Christian, I work at Bethel, I was born in Tokyo, mom and dad were missionaries, I have 2 sons and they're both married. Now, you've already got me pegged. You know a lot about me just by that look, because you know what groups I'm part of, right? But even when I don't do that, I am signaling to you who I am, and you're signaling who you are to me. So let's just see how good you are at reading signals. For example, who is this guy? Can you read what it says up above his left eye there? This is art. Okay. There's a whole thing going on here, right? And he's got a whole bunch of friends that are tied in with this, probably. In our part of the world, we live in the upper Midwest. This guy. I know. Totally annoying, right? Yeah. But they're around, you got to deal with what you got to deal with. A lot of years ago, I was spending time working in the summer. I just finished my dissertation. I'd kind of had it up to here with academics, and so I built houses for a summer. It was a great summer. Worked with a guy, rough and ready, and after a while he started to confide in me some of the things that were going on in his life, and to me it was obvious he needed Christ, and so I said, listen, come with me to church. And here's what he said. No way, not enough pickup trucks in your church parking lot. What? What does that have to do with anything? Your church your church parking lot, is full of minivans, and there's a lot of Toyotas and occasional Lexus in there, and culturally, we're different. Right? That's what he was saying. I totally didn't get it, but after a while it started to make perfect sense. By the way, what that tells you is the car you drive is a signal to the world about who you are. Right? That's why people pay $15,000 extra to buy something that has a little Beamer sticker on it. Not because it gets you to where you're going any better, because you all fight the same traffic jams I fight. It's a signal. It's a sign. Tells me who you are, and you're trying to let me know that. Ministry obviously has to pay close attention to this. My mom and dad going to Japan had to pay attention to cultural differences. What I think we're learning in seminary today is that every person who chooses to pastor is going to enter into a cultural context that's different than the other cultural contexts with which he or she is familiar. And that means every pastor is a missiologist. Some of you think, well, duh, but think about that for a minute. It's pretty profound. I want to mention as well that culture operates subconsciously, and this is really, really important. I'm sorry, I missed a point here. Culture tends to accumulate. There we go. Culture is growing and evolving. It's unpredictable how, but it's going to accumulate and it's going to leave traces behind. When things are sort of pass out of existence, their traces will remain. So it's always evolving, always adding new stuff, and you can't really do anything other than add new stuff into the cultural context. So the standard gauge railroad in the United States has the tracks at exactly 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. Did you know that? Why is it that oddball number? Why is it 4 8.5? There's an obvious answer, because that's how the English railroad system operated. But of course, that doesn't explain it, because you wonder, why did the English do it that way? And it's because before there were railroads, there were wagons. And wagons were that distance apart, and they created ruts, and so everything was kind of built to that scale. Well, why were the wagons in Britain built to that scale? Well, it's because the Romans did that. They had war chariots, and they put grooves in the ground, and if you're 3 inches wider than the groove, it doesn't work nearly as well. So. But then, of course, you wonder, why in the world did the Romans choose 4 8.5? Well, that's a good question, because it turns out that by trial and error, they experimented with their war chariots, and they found that with 2 horses' rear ends, 4 8.5 was just exactly the right distance to accommodate those 2, things. So our railroads today are what they are because of the butts of these Roman war horses. That's literally true. But actually it gets worse than that, because there's a company out in Utah called Morton Thiokol, which was a company that built the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle. And so they, of course, had to make these rocket boosters to the specifications that NASA put out there. And one of the specifications was they have to be able to move by rail car from Utah to Florida, where they're going to boost the shuttle. And they had to fit through the tunnels. And the tunnel size, of course, is determined by the size of the track. So 4 8.5 determines the size of the tunnel, and the tunnel determined the size of the solid rocket booster. So what it really comes down to is that our NASA shuttle subtle rocket booster design parameter is based on the butts of Roman war horses. And what that tells you is that culture is incredibly powerful, because it influences us in ways that you'd never even think, right? And that leads to this point that culture is subconscious. Because culture is something that I feel only when it's absent, not when it's present. So culture is like the ocean to the fish. When it's swimming in the ocean, it feels great. When it's flopping on the deck of your boat, then it's missing its culture and suddenly noticing that it's missing its culture in a very significant way. And that's the way we are as well. We call that culture shock. When you go to another culture, you don't realize what has changed, but you can feel it. I remember in college, I was in the college choir, and we toured. And while we were on tour, I just gotten this new camera. I thought it was great. So I took pictures of all my friends. And when the pictures came back, this was before digital, so it took a couple weeks for the pictures to come back. Every picture had this deep green tint to it. I thought, what? And then I realized all the bus windows were deeply tinted green, and the light coming through tinted all the light inside the bus green. But guess what? Nobody noticed it. And that's the way culture operates. Or those of you who wear glasses, if you don't have your glasses on, do you feel like, oh, have I forgotten my shoes? Or you feel a little bit like something's missing, right? Until I get my glasses on. You don't know you have glasses until you're not wearing them. Then you notice. So it turns out that culture actually passes on a set of glasses through which we're viewing the world. And we tend to forget that we're looking through the glasses at the world, right? We only notice them in the absence. And that's why it's so very easy for a person to get confused between my culture and the real world. Because actually, when I look at the world, I'm always looking through my glasses, but I forget that. So when I say to a person, or when we talk to each other, and we realize our cultures are different, it's a little startling at first, because it's easy to forget that the tint is in the glasses, not in the world. Does that make sense? By the way, John Calvin used this analogy of the Scripture. He called the Scripture spectacles. What do you think that analogy means? I'm not just looking at the Bible when I do Bible study. I'm looking at the world through the Bible. Does that make sense? The Bible's not just telling me specific stuff, it's giving me the categories through which I'm thinking about everything else. Yeah? So the Bible are like spectacles. And that means, of course, that when groups get together, they have a shared set of spectacles. When groups get together, they have a shared set of glasses by which they're looking at the world. So kids pick up their loyalty to the Green Bay Packers by osmosis at an early age. Now, Ralph tells me that they actually have classes on this in school over in Wisconsin. I think he's kidding me, though. I don't think he's telling me the truth. But culture passes on the way people see the world. Culture literally is how I see the world. Now, I have an extended case study that I'd like to take a look at here. So maybe I could get a little help. Kendall, can you help me on this side? And maybe Dave, you can help me. So grab this and pass it along. And we're going to look at the side that says Eddie Meltzer. And Eddie Meltzer is a handsome young Hispanic man from Orlando. And Eddie chose to enter into the recovery for the shooting that happened at the Pulse nightclub. And he had some interesting things to say. So you can read a little bit about his story there. But jump down to where it says this. Today I have decided to have a new ideology. I have decided that I needed to not give in to the hate of what these people want. They want chaos. They want us to suffer. Maybe I could have a copy too. Thank you. Okay. Who do you think is they in this sentence? What is he thinking? Yeah. Another group somewhere. They want us to suffer. So what does that tell you about the mentality? So one of the reasons I did some interviews is because I wanted to show them that they could not get through to us. We're going to go party as soon as we get better. Party really hard, be very gay, have a lot of fun. What's going on here? I get the sense that Eddie feels that there are groups of people outside his community that want him not to be who he really is. They want him to give up his very identity, the thing that defines his life more deeply than anything else. Does that make sense to you? That's who they are. And we're going to rebuild from the ashes stronger. And I'm not going to put any tears anywhere. I'm going to show them that I can come out stronger with more love. And that's what gets you through it. And then skip a paragraph, go down to that last full paragraph. This is very interesting. I'm just not going to subscribe to fear. We're a strong community, you know. We're gay men. We live in a world where we get a lot of hate. We take a lot of hate. We know how the world feels about us. Now just think for a moment, what do you think the average Christian thinks about the gay community? Like, is everybody opposed to them, or is everything going their way? And don't Christians often feel as though, man, everybody in Hollywood is on your team and for you, and all the legislation is going in your direction, and we're the ones who are taking a lot of hate? Some Christians feel. Do you think? And yet, here's a person who, from a gay perspective, is sharing his view that the world is out to suppress him. How interesting is that? We're strong because we live in a world that wasn't made for us. What does that mean? Like, America was made for straight Christians. And I'm neither. So this was not a place made for me. I'm in an alien, hostile environment. One of the things that I didn't reproduce here is that several of these people talked about the importance of the Pulse nightclub because that's a place where you could feel safe. Do you share that perspective? Probably not. But that talks about or illustrates how powerful this cultural perspective is. If tomorrow somebody took over this country and said, we're going to kill all the gays, I'll be the first one in the square saying, shoot me, because I would rather die for what I stand for. And then listen to this. You can't kill me. I'm an idea. I'm timeless. I think these are incredibly powerful words. I'm willing to die for this. I'm willing to die for my group. And even if you get me, my group is still here because we're here for the long haul. The notion that who I am and how I see the world is embedded in a culture comes out very, very strongly in that case study. So my culture is tied in very deeply and closely to my sense of self-identity. If somebody were to ask me to change my self-identity, that would be very, very hard. But those who tell the best stories shape the world, Erwin McManus says. All right, I'd like to take a pause here and just see if you have some comments or questions that you'd like to ask about that, and any thoughts you'd like to share. See, that's a very interesting question. But it's obvious that this means something to him that is pretty deep. Yeah. All right, let's move forward a little bit then. The other thing I wanted to say, in addition to this idea that culture's glasses are included, it also is the source of a group's plausibility structures. And what that means is, what seems plausible or what seems reasonable is very much determined by the nature of that group. So Tim Keller has written that everything about a culture reflects meaning. Every act, every piece of technology, every building, everything is an expression of the values of that culture. And so that means when we make culture, when we operate in the world, or when we produce art, or write a book, or make a policy, or any of that kind of stuff, we're reflecting cultural values. And this includes things like, what do you think about the material world? What do you think about law? What do you think about human freedom and choice or money? Or what do you think is reasonable? What makes sense to you? Francis Chan gave a fantastic example of this last night when he talked about the teacher who said that Jesus said, just trust your heart. It's like, well, just trust your heart. Go with what your heart says. That's deeply embedded in American culture. And it's contrary to what Scripture says, as he pointed out, right? But we don't think about that. Or what is our view of sexuality? Is it for pleasure, as Hugh Hefner says? Or is it for keeping score, as the player says? Or is it for family and children and fearing God? So every culture, every cultural artifact assumes answers to these kinds of questions. And when we remake culture, we're presupposing certain things. So culture shapes meaning. Ministry challenge, then, is to stay connected with the culture externally that may be contrary to what we believe at certain value points, and be relevant to the culture without naively embracing its principles and giving up the essence of the faith. So that is the challenge that we face. How can we stay relevant and connected and at the same time be true to the essence of the faith and stay deeply grounded in Scripture? That's a tough, tough balance. And most people tilt one way or the other. Colossians 2 verse 8 is a verse that says it very effectively. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elementary spiritual forces of this world rather than a philosophy based on Christ. In order to beware of the vain, hollow, deceptive philosophies of the world, we have to be aware of them. And so, how is it that we can relate to culture, stay connected and relevant, and at the same time stay connected to the gospel and to Scripture and retain the essence of the Christian message? This is the balance that we have to seek. Now, when working on this, I'd like to just briefly look at the history of the church and culture. Now we're talking about how the church relates to culture, and historically we've been all over the map on this. So obviously if you go back to the pre-Constantinian period, the first 3 centuries of the church was very oppositional. The church was standing in opposition to the broader culture. But then, as you remember, in 313, Constantine became the Roman emperor, and Christianity in the 300s became the legal religion of the world. And after a while, there became a close identification between the culture and the church. And so pagan culture and Christian teaching were closely and deeply connected. This is called the medieval synthesis. At the end of the Middle Ages, however, people were yearning for freedom and they wanted to get free of the oppressive institutions of culture. And in doing that, they wanted to get free both of the cultural principles of governance through monarchy as well as the religious principles of oppression through the church. And so when you see the modern world emerging in the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, you have people wanting to throw off both the king and the Pope. Because the king and the Pope were so identified, so closely connected. In fact, we call it the Holy Roman Empire. Remember that? It finally ended in the 1600s. But the Pope and the king were so deeply connected that to rebel against the Pope, to rebel against oppressive government, you had to rebel against the church. And so Diderot, a famous atheist, said, "Humankind will not be free until the last king is strangled in the guts of the last priest." Is that a zinger or what? But it helps you see how the close identification of church and state, creates an oppressive thing that the whole modern world was seeking to throw over. By the way, parenthesis, Swedish Baptists, which are our origin way, way back, were somewhat in rebellion to the state Lutheran Church of Sweden. So you can see the pattern again, right? Only we wanted to retain the Christian side and reestablish that, but not be under the power of the state church or the church state. Then the Reformation comes along, and it turns out that after the Protestant Reformation broke, all sorts of different perspectives broke out. You went all the way from the Episcopal approach, where the state church of England and the government of England are tied together, and so the Queen of England is still the protector of the faith, which seems kind of crazy. All the way to the other extreme of low church people like the Amish, who were completely separated from the broader culture. Then we come to the 19th century American context, and the great awakenings of that period influenced the spirituality of the post-Civil War period in an incredible way. It was in the last half of the 1800s where biblical faith had its greatest impact in American culture. Sometimes they think it was the colonial period, but actually it was more the post-Civil War period as a result of great awakenings and so forth. The tragedy, however, is that even as our biblically grounded faith was gaining incredible cultural power, there were intellectual forces that were about ready to undermine it. And they were typically around the area of science. So thoughts began to emerge in places like Germany, which said, if science is true, miracles are impossible. If miracles are impossible, Jesus did not rise from the dead. Higher criticism came up and said the Bible was not written by God's inspiration, it was written by human effort, right? It's just a human book. Darwin came along and said God did not create life, evolution accounts for life. And so these corrosive forces came to a head in the early part of the 20th century. Oops, I'm a little behind here, sorry. We're up to the 20th century now. And in the 20th century, at the beginning part of the 20th century, just about 100 years ago, the 1910s, we had a huge conflict between modernists and fundamentalists. And in that context, the debate between the modernists and the fundamentalists, a lot of it had to do with how they were going to handle the rise of science. The modernists, and today they are mainline denominations like the Presbyterian Church USA, for example, or the United Methodist Church, the modernists, or what are today called mainline, were decisively shaped by signing a peace treaty with science. They accommodated the scientific culture. They rejected miracles, they adopted evolution, they embraced higher criticism, which is a human Bible, and they also sided with the powerful classes, the upper class in our society. But the fundamentalists rejected the secular view of science. They abandoned scientific culture, and probably the greatest example of that was 1925 and the Scopes trial, where that was front page news for weeks here in the U.S. Biola, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, now Biola University, published a series of pamphlets. They called them the Fundamentals. They defended things like the Bible, the virgin birth, the necessity of the cross, the second coming of Jesus. But intellectually, they did not win the minds of America. And so a falling out happened between those who accommodated science and those who rejected science. Now, I think there's a middle way here, and that's a whole nother talk for another day. But we did not, as a movement, do a very good job with that group. And so the liberals took all the big churches and all the big seminaries and pushed fundamentalists to the edge of culture. By the way, parenthesis, one little skirmish in that whole battle was the Swedish department of the University of Chicago. Does anybody know what that is? It's the predecessor of Bethel University. Bethel University used to be the Swedish department of the University of Chicago, and in 1915, got kicked out. So we went to Nebraska for a couple of years and then ended up in St. Paul and connected with a school called Bethel, and that's how we became Bethel. And this division between modernists and fundamentalists, Bethel was right in the middle of that, interestingly enough. So all the big churches and all the big schools and all the institutions went with the modernists. Like the Golden State Warriors, the modernists jumped out to an early lead. Just trying to make sure you're still awake here. But the modernist gamble turned out to be a Faustian bet with the devil. And today, the accommodation of culture, so giving into culture, okay, accommodating culture, has led to not increased popularity, but decreased influence. And these mainline churches, unfortunately, are bleeding. But like the Cavaliers, the fundamentalists came back. In 1942, the National Association of Evangelicals was founded. Then Billy Graham exploded on the scene. There was a day in the 1950s when people said, what does it mean to be an evangelical? And Marty said, if you agree with Billy Graham, you're an evangelical. That means if you were theologically and religiously a Bible-believing, Christ-following conversionist, you're an evangelical. And that evangelical movement exploded. In fact, by 1976, Time magazine called it the year of the evangelical. But lest you think that all's joy in Mudville, sticking with the sports metaphor here, things went downhill. In 1980, a guy named Jerry Falwell started something called the Moral Majority and backed Ron Reagan for president on the agreement that once Ron Reagan became president, he would enact all of Jerry Falwell's socially conservative concepts. Guess what happened? Reagan won and Falwell lost. Because Reagan won, but he didn't keep his side of the bargain. And the main result of that whole episode of the Moral Majority in the early 80s is that the word evangelical has come to mean right-wing politics. Completely different meaning. It does not mean what it meant in Billy Graham's day, which was conversion, Bible, the cross, following Christ, making a difference in the world based on the love of Christ. But it has come to mean right-wing politics. And from there, it was a short step forward to an event 1 year ago this week, June 26, 2015. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4. You know the story, right? And so in a way, we're experiencing, and we feel this, we're experiencing 1916 all over again in 2016. Only this time, it's not that liberalism is using ecclesiastical power, it's that the government is using political power. But there's still a sense in which it feels as though evangelicalism is being pushed to the edges of culture. So what to do about that? Well, there are models as to how to see this, and one is very important, and I'm not going to go into this at all, but his name is H. Richard Niebuhr, and the book is called Christ and Culture from 1951. It's a very important and very influential book. You might want to just Google it and read the Reader's Digest version. But it turns out that Niebuhr had this a continuum all the way from an Episcopal Christ of culture, where the culture and Christianity were the same, all the way to Christ against culture, where it was almost an Amish separationism. And then there are shades of other positions in between. When we think about this in the contemporary context, though, there are sort of, you might call them schools of thought, three different ways of thinking about this, and I'm going to suggest a fourth way. One way is to think about this from a perspective of transformation of worldviews. This is an intellectual approach. It's very confrontational, and it's very much about let's critique culture. Confront the intellectual ideas of the culture. And I would say there's something valid here, but it's probably not sufficient. Because we do need to think clearly and with deep wisdom. And humbly, I would like to say this is where I think our movement needs a seminary that is thinking deeply about these things and sharing this with the culture. As I said before, when we're in a contra-culture situation, it's a harder situation to be in, and we have to be sharper than. But we need to think clearly, and at the same time, we also need to act humbly and courageously. So the problem with this worldview thing is if I write a critical argument or do a great blog that really zings someone, then my work is done. Well, no, I don't think so. We have to love people and help them move along. Another approach is the social justice model, which is closer to the culture. Love the poor with deeds of mercy. And again, I think there's something right about this, but not sufficient. It's interesting, by the way, that when I went down south with my church group to Mississippi and put roofs on houses for a week in the wake of Katrina, I didn't see the American atheists there putting roofs on people's houses. I saw the Fire Baptized Church from St. Louis. I saw some Presbyterians from New Jersey. I saw, World Relief and Samaritan's Purse, but I didn't see the American atheists. And by the way, that's statistically, the way it is. The people who are doing the work like in the toughest neighborhoods of our cities, they're believers who are living out faith in Jesus, So statistically, we're doing a lot in this area, and that's a good thing. It's expressing the love of Jesus. I don't think we get credit for it in the media, but that's not why people do these things. They do it because they love Christ, right? But the key thing on this, I think, is the why question. Why do we want to serve the poor? A young woman graduated from Bethel several years ago. Her grandfather was a beloved art professor, Gene Johnson. And she loved her grandfather dearly and went out to a West Coast city and started working among the homeless. Her granddad was retired, went out to visit her. They spent 3 days together. They had a wonderful time. But at the end of that time, he said to her, "I don't think you're doing this for Jesus." She was like hurt. What do you mean? And her grandfather had really put a finger on something. But after this young woman thought about it for a while, she came to realize she wasn't really helping the homeless because she loved God or Christ. She was helping the homeless because it was the fashionable thing to do. It was the cool thing to do. Okay? The millennial generation is a generation of people that understands social justice and wants to be engaged in social justice. But at Jean's funeral, this granddaughter stood up and said, "I had to check my motives and to not do homeless ministry because that's what Brad and Angelina do, but do home ministry or homeless ministry because this is an expression of faith." And that's a tricky balance to get. We need to side with those in need, but serve in the spirit of Jesus, not in the spirit of Hollywood, in light of the gospel, and not as imitators of Brangelina. And then there's a third kind of perspective or attitude on this, which is just build the church. Just do evangelism. Don't do anything else. Don't help the poor. That's a waste of money. Put it into church planting. I can acknowledge that I felt pieces of this in the missionary community that I grew up with. Like, we didn't want to do anything except evangelism only. Right? Build the church. That's it. Nothing else. I think that obviously there has to be a focus on building the church, and I'm all in favor of what we're doing as a movement in that regard. But we have to do more than this, or we'll contribute to the marginalization of the church. When we win people for Christ, it cannot be something like this. Become a Christian, live your faith at home, volunteer at church, and then the rest of the week do your own thing. Because then we privatize faith, and we abandon the culture to secularism. So, without an intellectually robust vision for how we as Christians can live out our faith in the marketplace, I think we risk getting separated from the culture. So this is an area, I think, where we could grow. We track, of course, at Bethel who the students are, where they come from. And this year, the number one high school spot changed. Previously it was a different high school. This year, the number one high school sending students to the freshman class at Bethel is homeschoolers. Now that's an interesting change. They used to be a tiny percentage. Now there's no other school that has this many students. Now I understand that, and I think it's valuable, and also, especially when you're talking about children, okay, but as adults, we need to connect with the culture. So we need to act holistically, showing deep compassion and living sacrificially in the world, but to do it as evidence of the gospel. So Tim Keller says we really need to blend the insights of all these three perspectives into and gather the value of all of them. An extreme version of any one of these three approaches would be sort of out of kilter, as it were. And all three have valid insights, and we need to kind of blend them in. So that means we need to think critically about worldview issues, for sure. It's a little bit of what we're doing today. Definitely want to connect with the poor, those who are oppressed. That actually adds credibility to the message. Yes? And of course, we also want to build the church. So holistically do all three together. All right, so then how do we engage the culture? So this is now the punchline. First of all, there's some lessons to be learned. George Santayana, you know this quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So let's learn the lessons of history here. And one lesson that we can learn is the lesson of modernism, because modernism made a peace treaty with secular culture, thinking they would be relevant. They didn't turn out to be relevant, they turned out to be irrelevant. So accommodation doesn't work. You squander the essence of the faith. Now, I believe in being relevant. We have to be relevant, but you got to think carefully about what that means, I would say. So the lesson of modernism is that accommodation is a bad idea. But I also talked about the other group, fundamentalism. That didn't work out too well either. Because fundamentalism was not into accommodation, they were into fortification. That was like, let's build a big wall and protect ourselves behind it. And every now and then we'll throw, a little gospel bomb over the wall. That doesn't work. It's worse than nothing. People seek purity through separation, but then you lose the right to influence the world. And so that doesn't work either. Accommodation on the one hand, fortification on the other hand. Now, how about the lesson of the moral majority? If you read the Converge statement of faith, do you notice it has a very interesting statement in there about state and church? There aren't too many groups that have that in their doctrinal statement, right? Doctrinal statements talk about the Bible and Jesus and salvation and God and the Trinity and, the coming of Christ and all that sort of thing. And we've got a statement in there that says we believe in the separation of church and state. It's like, what does that have to do with, the virgin birth? But I think there's wisdom in that, because the attempt to take over culture and to use political force to enforce our values and beliefs typically backfires. And that's what happened with the moral majority. Accommodation, fortification, and domination. To seek impact through the use of political power creates backlash that actually creates a worse situation than when you started. Back in 2005, Pat Robertson was on the 700 Club, and he called on the U.S. to assassinate Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. Like, seriously? This is Christian Broadcasting Network, and this is what you have to say? The next day, all the missionaries were thrown out of Venezuela. Okay, so that did not work, right? What does work? We need to create culture. First of all, let's recognize that all human beings create culture, And that includes people who are not Christians as well as people who are Christians. So the question is not, are we going to create culture? The question is, are we going to be purposeful about creating it in a way that's honoring to God? Because one way or another, we're going to create culture. It's unavoidable, right? And the other thing to recognize is that all culture is a mixed bag, morally speaking. So the culture we create is probably not going to be perfect. And also we can say that the culture that others create may have some redeeming values in it. There might be something we can learn from culture created by people who are not Christians, even. Because after all, they're made in the image of God too. So we need to move out into the world by living and working to put God's way on display. So here are my words. Not accommodation. That's what the modernists and the liberals have done. And basically, you kind of zone out of existence doing that. Not fortification, where you lose all connection to the culture. Not domination, but incarnation. How do we minister in the culture? Well, I think one way to think about this is we can connect with what is true and good and beautiful in the culture. So, not everything we create is perfect, and not everything the secular world creates is horrible. There is truth in the broader world that we can connect to, I believe. For example, if you believe in human rights and the dignity of all human persons, then you believe Christian truth. You may be an atheist, but you believe in something that came from Christian faith. Because after all, as one philosopher said, if you're a secularist, you're going to reason like this. We descended from apes, therefore let us love one another. Wait a second. Where did this idea of love one another come from? Didn't come from evolution. It came from Jesus. And that Christian idea is pervasive in our culture. Could we help people see that actually something that resonates with them very, very, very deeply doesn't make sense on a secularist and evolutionist viewpoint, but makes all the sense in the world if God created us in His image and commanded us to love each other? Or beauty. Think of the artistic forms that resonate with culture. Martin Luther said, why should the devil have all the good music? So he took a bar tune, you probably know, and put the words of A Mighty Fortress to it. On the back side of your case studies, I have a case study on The Big Short. If you haven't seen the movie, I would encourage you to do it. It's a powerful lesson about goodness, truth, and beauty. When the dust settled from the Wall Street collapse, $5 trillion had vanished. 8 million people lost their jobs, 6 million people lost homes just in the US. Lehman Brothers stock price went to zero. Moody's and S&P were in on the collusion, but when two individuals tried to sue them, they were laughed out of the law offices. At the climax of the story, Mark Baum, who's played by Steve Carell from The Office, gives a little speech, and here's what he says. My first thesis is pretty simple. Wall Street took a good idea, Louis Ranieri's mortgage bond, and turned it into an atomic bomb of fraud and stupidity that's on its way to decimating the world economy. We live in an era of fraud in America, not just in banking, but in government, education, religion, food, even baseball. What bothers me isn't that fraud is not nice or that fraud is mean. It's that for 15,000 years, fraud has never worked, not even once. Eventually people get caught, things go south. Why did we forget this? I thought we were better than this. Okay, he's got a moral sense. Do you see that? He's got a moral compass here. I thought we were better than this. I really did. And the fact that we're not doesn't make me feel all right and superior. It makes me feel sad. As fun as it is to watch dumb, pompous Wall Streeters be wildly wrong, I just know that at the end of the day, average people are going to be the ones that are going to have to pay for this because they always, always do. That's my 2 cents. Now, what's the truth in that? People are sinners. And they will take advantage of people if they can. And there will be people at the bottom end of the social structure who will take it on the chin because people are evil. But there's also this moral principle here. It's just plain wrong to stick it to the poor, right? He's got this moral sense there. And of course, this film is an art form, and as such, resonates deeply. So, to me, The Big Short is a great example of a part of culture that embeds Christian truth without even knowing it. How can we connect with that and show how that makes more sense based on a Christian fact? Philippians 4:8 is one of my faves. And here the Apostle Paul says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, and admirable, if it's excellent or praiseworthy, think about these things." Now, what's interesting about this verse is that in the Greek, the words for true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, those are actually pagan virtues. Those are words for things that are not love, joy, peace, long-suffering, Christian things. Those are pagan words. And we can redeem them because we share the image of God, even though we have cultural differences. Now, we also have to challenge what's distorted. Because some of the things that resonate in culture with Christian truth are good, for sure. But we also have to challenge the not good part of culture. So Tim Keller points out very beautifully, you can't resonate only. That equals accommodation. If all you're doing is resonating, you're just agreeing on everything, you're just accommodating. And, with modernism, we see where that goes, right? But on the other hand, you can't just challenge all the time either. That's where the separatists went. No one will listen. So we have to do this carefully and thoughtfully. And for me, I think it's very helpful to distinguish between form and content. When we seek to be relevant, we have to pay attention to forms, but we have to make sure we've got Christian content. Now, this is a tricky thing. But think about online education. We at Bethel Seminary started online education 15 years ago. Our theology is traditional. Our online methodology is non-traditional. It's very cutting edge. Now, I know some other seminaries, by the way, they're losing students, but very liberal, way out on the left end of the spectrum. They wouldn't have an online course if you put a gun to their head. But their theology is completely non-traditional. Do you see? So that's an example of a place where the form of online education is something that can be embraced, but the content needs to be biblical. And there are actually schools that have done the opposite. They're non-traditional in theology, but very traditional in their education. Thinking of some East Coast schools here that are like that. The benefit of culture is that it operates out of consciousness, but it's also the danger because it can operate out of consciousness and we're not aware of that. Here's another example. This is Yoga Magazine. I had to get this off the internet. I don't subscribe. But yoga is actually religious. Did you know that? Yeah. It's from a religious perspective. But what's interesting is that you've got articles like 24 natural beauty products for yogis. I think there's some yogis in India who don't give a rip about beauty products. Food for thought, 4 takes on conscious eating. It's supposed to be conscious about how you eat. Poses for wisdom for a peaceful season. 6 ways to glow from within. That made me want to buy it right there. But what's interesting about this here is that yoga is being sold as a means to the American way of life. And I think the same logic applies with the health and wealth gospel. The American dream of health and wealth, Jesus is the best way to get there. Wait a second. Jesus isn't a means to anything, right? Jesus is the end. Loving Christ, being in deep affection and love with the Father. That's the end, not a means to the American dream. The American dream is sidebar here. But it's easy for us to fall into that little danger. And then finally, I would say, let us build on what is noble and good. Instead of telling people to stop doing this, what we really should do is to say, here's a better way, because it's God's way. This is how you can live a life of flourishing, and ultimately live a life that brings honor to God. Because in the end, ministry is a form of culture making. You're actually making new pathways of behavior, of perspective, of connection with life. Several years ago, I went to a large church, and my topic was theology of sexuality. Sandy hates this topic. She never comes when I do this topic, but anyway, I did it this night. And I didn't give them a title, so they composed the title for the talk and made a big poster. And when I walked in, it said, "Thou shalt not, a theology of sexuality," Dr. David Clark from Bethel Seminary. And I was like, that's exactly the opposite of what I'm going to say. What I'm going to say is, theology of sexuality, thou shalt, within God's plan, right? It should be a great big yes, not a great big no. How can we speak about sexuality in such a way that it actually resonates with a, ironically, sex-crazed, but also sex-starved or love-starved culture? Can we say a thou shalt in this zone and say it in a way that is good and noble and feels positive? I think we can. Because every no is the flip side of a yes. When I said I do to Sandy, I wasn't thinking about this at the moment, but implicitly I was saying I don't to about 3 billion other women who could potentially have been, I wasn't too worried about that. But you can't just focus on the no side. In fact, it makes more sense to focus on the yes side so that people understand that the life we have lived in the love of God is such a powerful, wholesome, noble, God-honoring way to thrive, that why wouldn't you say no to this other crud in order to get this, in order to see this? That's building on the noble side. It's the opposite of what we have done too often. So we replace bad culture with good culture by building strong families and marriages. That's actually culture building, right? Being purposeful and intentional about that. It's a beautiful thing. By excelling at work. I love it when the guy at the office that everybody turns to for help when things go badly is the Christian guy, who has gained a reputation by faithful life and service over a lifetime or over a career to be the go-to guy in the moment. That's the way we should live. By building excellence into every aspect of life and doing ministry to the glory of God. I've been reflecting on Jeremiah 29 recently, and it's an interesting scenario where the children of Israel are carted off into Babylon. And so the prophet writes them a letter and tells them, you know this, right, how to live in Babylon. And there are these wonderful things in there, like I have plans for you to prosper. It also says, seek me with all your heart, because I will be found. But in that context, The text also says in verse 7 that we should seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for the city, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And I think that is a positive way of thinking about how we can connect with culture. The church is supposed to show up the world. Remember the book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten? Yeah, there's a lesson in there, which is that when it comes to telling people about whatever cool thing you bring to class, that part of the class is called show and tell. Yeah. So with regard to the Christian faith, that's a good way to do it. Show it and tell it. There are some people who are into showing and never tell. That doesn't work because people don't know why you're showing it. But on the other hand, if all you do is tell, that doesn't work either. That's a holistic way of thinking about it. So I think what God is calling us to do is to provide a wonderful model of what it means to be a genuine human being, to live in a life that is full of human flourishing. So much so that the alternative, what the world has to offer, seems sordid and shabby by comparison. It seems like a place of death instead of a place of life. We go there with the fullness of the gospel, and we acknowledge the mixed nature of culture, and yet seek to build good culture in the name of Jesus. Not by assimilating or accommodating, not by separating, trying to get purity, or worst of all, not by getting angry and trying to dominate. That never works. But rather by being a hopeful movement of redemptive and incarnational love that works for the flourishing of all God's people. We could be that. Show and have it be remarkable, and then tell why it's so remarkable. I think we could connect with culture and not succumb to culture. And that's the tricky balance of ministry. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience today, and I hope this has been helpful to you. May God bless you in the places that God has called you to work. I'd like to just pray a prayer of blessing for each of you, and we'll wrap up. It's been so good to be together this afternoon, dear Father, and we're thankful for your blessings in our lives. And as we come to a session like this, we do long to be a godly and positive influence in our culture. And I pray that you will give us that perfect balance of showing and telling, of being incarnations of your love into our world. Showing what it means by living lives that are flourishing, from our marriages to our families, to our neighbor relationships, to our work, to each and everything we do. And then may we as well have the courage to explain it and the clarity to do it well. Father, for each person in this room, I pray your blessing on the work that they're doing in your name. Much of it is hidden, never gets on the evening news, but I know it's in your eye and you are aware. And so I thank you for that, and I pray that you'll bless each one as a result of our being together today. Now go with us with your peace. I ask that in the name of Christ and by the power of the Spirit. Amen.